My name is Nicholas Kendall, and I'm a current undergraduate student. I'm very delighted to be able to represent the Nor Cal Organizing Committee in introducing our keynote speaker today. This keynote session is accredited by CME, and more details about that can be found on the website. So I'm excited to introduce today's speaker and the urgent topic that she will be addressing. Dr. Heather McMullen is a social scientist in the Global Public Health Unit at the Center for Public Health and Policy at the Wolfson Institute of Population Health, Queen Mary University of London. She has a background in medical social science and specifically in the area of sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice. She conducts research in this area, but also works with civil society and multilateral organizations. Her recent work explores how climate change and other environmental crises relate to sexual and reproductive rights, justice, and politics. She is currently a visiting scholar at the Reproductive Sociology Group at the University of Cambridge. Her address today is titled, A Crisis of Bodily Autonomy, Reproductive Health, Rights, and Climate Justice. So please type any questions you have into the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll moderate that throughout the session so that we have some questions that we can ask at the end. So thanks everyone for being here today, and here's Dr. McMullen.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm just going to pull up some slides and get started. So let me see. Great. Can everyone see those? Yeah. Fabulous. So I'd like to start by saying thank you very much for having me. It's a huge honor and a pleasure to be here today. And I hope that we'll be able to explore some interesting topics for you. It's a special pleasure being a social scientist, being invited to talk to medical professionals as well. So thank you for that. I'd like to start first by declaring no conflicts of interest, but also acknowledging important collaborators. As someone has already mentioned, collaboration is key. And a lot of what I'm sharing today relies on work and exchanges I've had with multiple collaborators. That includes Catherine Dow at the University of Cambridge, and I also work quite closely with a team at the United Nations Population Fund listed here, who I'd like to acknowledge as well. And also, the wide range of activists, interlocutors, and friends and other thinkers who have helped shape my thinking. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what the intersections between sexual and reproductive rights, health, and justice might be, some key frameworks for helping us think through these intersections, some contemporary examples, and then a bit of a discussion on what we can do. And then importantly, also time for your questions. So you may be wondering, so how do sexual and reproductive rights, health, and justice come together with climate change? It's maybe not the most obvious set of intersections, but at the base, people need control over their bodies to respond to a changing climate. And people cannot respond to the climate crisis without bodily autonomy, without sexual and reproductive health and rights. And this is really a cornerstone to building resilience and essential for a just response to the current emergency. But this is becoming increasingly evident. And as Naomi Klein says in the title of one of her most famous books, this changes everything. And I suppose what I'm here to talk about too is how this changes dimensions of life that are sort of fundamental, that are intimate, that are about people's bodies and decisions and choices. And the climate crisis is also affecting these areas of life. So without the ability to make choices about one's body, one's life, and one's future, the crisis goes beyond the regular headlines associated with climate change and directly impacts our health, our bodies, and our intimate lives. If you can't decide if, when, or how many children you'd like to have, if you don't have reproductive autonomy, if you can't protect yourself or get support for gender-based violence, if you can't access health services because you're too young or you're unmarried or you're denied services, if you're struggling with untreated illness or infection like STIs, or you lose access to your HIV medication, if you don't have access to basic sanitation and menstrual health supplies and hygiene, it's difficult to cope with life in general, and even more difficult in the face of climate change impacts, such as floods and droughts, less access to food and water, and all of the things brought on by extreme weather events. So to leave no one behind means engaging with sexual and reproductive health and rights, and recognizing that this does include some of the most stigmatized, deprioritized, and yet fundamental dimensions of life. And this is also an area where we tend to see an acute coming together of multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and inequality, requiring even more urgent attention. So the message I'd like to reiterate today is that climate change is indeed a crisis of inequality, but also one of bodily autonomy. And as a result, sexual and reproductive rights, health, and justice represent a key intersection in need of attention and investment. And this is really essential in building a more equal world and a more just world out of the challenges we face. So I've included a few headlines from the last couple of years here to really show how we're starting to see intersections between climate change, sexual and reproductive rights, health, and justice, and how you can also see that there's quite a lot of alarm featured in this. And one of the things we see when talking about reproduction is thinking about the future and thinking about future generations and children and onwards, and children and young people, and especially young women, have actually played a very key role in galvanizing the climate justice movement and in actually advancing action towards climate change. So perhaps because of that, when we think about the future and then we think about reproductive health and rights, it's surprising that this intersection hasn't received more attention. But in my experience working at the intersection of this over the last 5 years or so, I can say that more and more evidence is coming forward and more interest is growing in this area. So I'm now going to provide a couple of examples, because you may still be wondering, how do these things come together? And it's far from a full list, but it includes some idea of where the evidence base is growing and some of the intersections that require our attention. And this is, most of what we see here is a lot of indirect effects. So, as you see increasing precarity, vulnerability, and inequality, and a sort of set of worsening general conditions for life, you do sort of see these knock-on effects onto various dimensions of health and well-being. But there are also some direct impacts worth describing. So what are some of these intersections? So in the last couple of years, we've seen a substantial increase of the evidence base that links the impacts of heat and air pollution to, for example, to poor pregnancy and perinatal health outcomes. And this range of impacts is substantial and expanding, and I will spend a bit more time on it later in the presentation. But if we do take a view of how climate change might be impacting maternal and child health, I think we can see some examples on this slide. So if we think of a pregnant person living in an area with already compromised access to services, this won't be improved during climate change and, such as during extreme weather events. And UNFPA colleagues of mine have described women giving birth in trees, for example, during Hurricane Idai in Mozambique, and just how general disruption in access to sexual and reproductive health services causes increases in maternal mortality and morbidity. And lack of access to what's really needed for safe deliveries and maternal care. As temperatures get hotter and air quality is getting worse, we've seen impacts such as preterm labor, stillbirth, and adverse perinatal outcomes. So we also know that heat and air pollution is impacting maternal and child health. Another recognized impact of climate and health is an increase in climate-related diseases. So as climate change impacts such as weather patterns change, we see changes in vector-borne diseases as well. So as they take over sort of new habitats that weren't hospitable to them previously. So we have seen increases in vector-borne diseases where they did not previously exist. And this includes malaria, Zika, dengue, and other diseases which are more dangerous for pregnant people and also have impacts on child health as well. We see increases in poverty and disruptions to food systems and water access, and also how this impacts maternal health and nutrition. Good nutrition is also essential for the effective functioning of HIV medication, for example, which may further have impacts on pregnant HIV positive people. And there's many more impacts as well. The WHO has recently done an excellent infographic, but also a lot of work on the mental health impacts of climate change. And we know that can increase stress, disrupt sleep, disrupt the health of pregnant women, but also cause interpersonal strife within families, including increases in violence. And ensuring access to high quality sexual and reproductive rights and health services is harder when there's floods, when there's disasters, when people have less mobility and less income. And this is a challenge at the best of times, and one that's exacerbated in times of crisis brought on by climate change. And this kind of coincides with aspects of gender inequality. So in settings where women have less access to services, less access to public information, to finances, less ability to express their voice and their experiences, we know that sexual and reproductive rights and health struggle. And we also know that they tend to be deprioritized in times of crisis too, and some of that was evident during COVID-19. So that sort of encourages us to centralize the impacts on SRHR, even more so in the face of climate crisis, which we know brings on a number of competing priorities for health services, resources, and onwards. There's also intersections between climate and environmental crises and gender-based violence, and the evidence base is also growing with this, and I've done a little bit of work on this with my colleagues at UNFPA. So during times of environmental crisis, during disasters, during times of stress and scarcity, we do see increases in gender-based violence. For example, the Tana Women's Counseling Service reported a 300% increase in reports of gender-based violence following 2 tropical cyclones in 2011. Similar data from Uganda showed spikes in gender-based violence following drought. And we also know that when there's a sort of less access to natural resources and women and children are needing to walk further to collect water or to collect firewood or fuel for the home, then they can be at increased exposure to violence as well as spend less time in productive activities such as education or working in their kind of livelihoods. And that all of this sort of impacts the frequency of gender-based violence too. In general, during times of stress and scarcity and when natural resources become less available, we see this increase. And this is really a mix between climate and environmental crises. And sometimes we make this distinction, but I think for communities, they face these things together. It's not like I'm just experiencing an environmental crisis and not a climate one, or a climate one and not an environmental one. And so we sort of take the view at how both climate and environmental crises come together for people on the ground. And it's been widely recognized that specific threats to women and girls who are disproportionately affected by complex emergencies and forced migration are going to see increases in gender-based violence. And importantly as well, and I don't want to miss out on this, is that environmental defenders, so people who take on trying to defend environmental commons, try to challenge extractive industries, have also been disproportionately affected by violence. This includes women who are environmental defenders, and Global Witness has done quite a lot of work on this, who have been assaulted and killed and also experienced sexual violence in their efforts to protect environmental commons, to protect resources, and to prioritize the interests of the community in terms of environmental resources. And we've also recently, as a result of the work that I do with UNFPA, done a sort of evidence review and literature review on the relationship between climate change, environmental challenges, and child marriage. And what we've seen is that climate and environmental crises do exacerbate the drivers of child marriage. So this is because of the pressures that they put on families due to disasters and extreme weather events. And marriages can be seen as a way to reduce financial pressure, sometimes to move a girl child to a location that's safer from environmental threats. It can also be in times of disaster to try to protect girl children from threats of sexual violence. But we also see how increases in child marriage are a result of disruption to education and also disruption to sort of systems that are protective of gender equality and well-being. And we also see how sometimes early forced and child marriage is linked with other harmful practices, such as female genital cutting. So I think what these examples do is kind of show how climate impacts exacerbate the drivers of existing sexual and reproductive rights injustices and also gender inequality, kind of creating a more dire picture for sexual and reproductive rights and health, which is why we need to act. As part of my work with UNFPA, we've also explored how sexual and reproductive rights and health are featured in national climate policy, including nationally determined contributions, which are one of the main climate policy documents submitted by countries and territories. And some of the intersections I've described here, such as impacts on maternal and child health, as well as increases in gender-based violence, are some of the most referenced. And we've looked at kind of hundreds of national climate policies, and where you do start to see intersections between climate change, health, and gender and SRHR is largely through references to impacts on maternal child health and gender-based violence. So this was kind of a view of some of the ways that we're seeing these intersections emerge, but I'd also like to present some frameworks that could be helpful for us in starting to think through these intersections. So the reproductive justice and environmental justice framework, or reproductive justice frameworks, I think help us think very carefully about frameworks for considering these intersections. So the reproductive justice movement is defined sort of by the three tenets here, and it's a contemporary framework for activism and thinking about reproduction and social justice. So it's a political movement as well that centers social justice and human rights. And it was developed by women of color in the United States in the lead up to the 1994 Conference on Population and Development in Cairo. So a group of women called Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice met in Chicago and launched reproductive justice as a movement to give voice to the most marginalized women, families, and communities. It's also a response to the long history of racist oppression of Indigenous women, women of color, and trans and non-binary people, particularly in relation to experiences of forced sterilization, population control, lack of access to adequate sexual and maternal health care, and really focuses on ending violence, ensuring housing rights. It looks at immigrant rights, and it also looks at aspects of environmental racism. It sets out the three tenets here, and these tenets, I think, really encourage important questions, and you can see one there on the right to parent children and safe and healthy environments, which is quite pertinent to what we're discussing today. There's really a lot to learn about reproductive justice, so I would encourage you to also take a look at work by the Sister Song Collective, by Loretta Ross, Jade Sasser, and numerous other reproductive justice scholars, because I couldn't possibly do justice in describing it as quickly as I just have. Importantly, this framework has been extended to also consider the environment. So environmental reproductive justice was coined by Mohawk midwife Katsy Cook, who was concerned about the effects of PCB contamination of water and land on the food chain, as well as Indigenous people's ability to safely breastfeed their children. And so while reproductive justice brings together reproductive rights and social justice, environmental reproductive justice adds environmental justice to the mix, and really urges attention to the ways that environmental injustice and reproductive injustice intersect. So while environmental reproductive justice advocates do recognize the impact of environmental injustice on impairing biological reproduction, they extend this to also consider social and cultural reproduction. So, you know, the ability to care for children and other family members, the ability to safely feed children, cultural reproduction in terms of also being able to continue cultural practices and traditions, such as cultivating and eating culturally appropriate foods. And one of the important things these two frameworks really does is sort of move beyond thinking about rights, but also thinking about things like access. So it's great that we have reproductive rights, but if you can't enact those rights and you can't access services because of existing structural determinants, then really do we have justice? And so some of these frameworks really push some of the existing ways that we think about sort of reproductive rights or environmental rights to move us towards thinking more holistically around what really enables and creates justice. And further on that note, we can't not also describe climate and environmental justice as important frameworks too. So climate justice really helps us recognize how climate change is about more than an environmental crisis, but is also a social, economic, and political crisis, and that the impacts of this are not felt evenly. So some people, groups, and geographies are harder hit, while others are more responsible for having created the crisis. And so it describes how this isn't by accident, but because of existing systems of power and oppression in society. So it takes, all of the approaches I've described center intersectionality and take an intersectional approach to consider how climate impacts exacerbate existing inequalities. And also, really asks us to think about the burdens and responsibilities for responding to the crisis and ensuring that the types of solutions that we put forward don't replicate the logics and structures of power that exist and that have in many ways created the climate crisis, but move us towards a more just transition and solutions that are sort of evenly distributed and shared, and that they don't place undue burden on groups who are already marginalized in society. So we don't want to see a replication of exploited and extractive practices, but we want to see a centering of people and communities, especially the most marginalized, who are hardest hit and who may have the least access to social and political power. And related to this are environmental justice and environmental racism, which are key to a lot of the intersections that we describe in this space. And environmental justice is typically thought back to 1982, when civil rights activists protest the dumping of soil laced with PCB in Warren County, North Carolina. So environmental racism describes the effects of racial discrimination on environmental policy, such as disproportionately targeting communities of color for toxic waste dumping, polluting industries, and the removal of degradation of natural habitats, as well as the exclusion of particular groups from environmental leadership. So it's really the idea defined by sociologist Robert Bullard that all people and communities are entitled to equal protection of environmental and public health laws and regulations. So all of these frameworks draw attention to issues of justice, power, discrimination, intersectionality, and really moving towards more just responses to the crises that we face. And they really ask us some key questions too. And some of the questions I find really helpful for us to consider is who is encouraged to reproduce, who is not, and under what circumstances, whose reproduction is protected and supported, who's being asked to take on the burden of mitigating and adapting to climate change, and are the solutions we're putting forward supporting the most marginalized in our society, and is how we're responding to the climate crisis, including with our health responses, likely to challenge the logics and the drivers that created climate change and uphold inequality? Or are they more likely to help us build justice and to help us create new structures where we see more equality for everyone? So on that note, and with these questions in mind, I'd like to now quickly explore a couple of examples. So what are some key examples that help us think about not only the intersections between sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice and climate change, but also that call on aspects of these frameworks? So if we think about whose reproduction is protected and supported, and also unequal exposures, if we revisit some of the data that's coming out of the impacts of climate change on maternal health, I think we find some interesting findings. So some academic papers from the United States describe how a lot of these outcomes that are described here, such as the high temperatures linked with preeclampsia and disturbed sleep, the sort of hot temperatures leading to lower birth weights, and also, the impacts of air pollution, we can see that this is worse for women of African descent. And this really highlights the role of structural inequalities and environmental racism in mediating climate impacts on health. So as a recent systematic review on the association between air pollution and heat exposure and preterm birth, low birth weight, and stillbirth in the US, was really sort of one of the most, that came out in 2020, one of the most helpful pieces of research in this area. And to quote from that article by Becker and al., it says, among racial and ethnic groups, our findings suggest that Black mothers are at greater risk for preterm birth and low birth weight. Social determinants of health, including residents in urban areas with higher exposure to air pollutants and long-term high levels of stress, are known to contribute to adverse obstetrical outcomes. A recent study from California suggested that particulate matter exposure alone was associated with an equivalent amount of the racial disparity in preterm birth rates, as did other demographic and social factors. Our research suggests that these environmental exposures further exacerbate that background risk and could be included among these social determinants. So these studies establish associations between environmental exposures like air pollution and heat with poor birth outcomes and demonstrate how this is particularly acute for particular groups. And as some authors note, these risks will worsen with increased climate change and pollution, making this a pressing matter of environmental and reproductive justice and an example of the impacts of environmental racism. This also helps us think about the question of whose reproduction is protected and supported and engages a number of the key frameworks just described. To turn to another example, another sort of important intersection that we hear about in the climate and sexual and reproductive rights and health space is the role of family planning. So in 2017, a report from Project Drawdown suggested that in the top 100 solutions to climate change, number 6 and number 7 were educating girls and family planning. And as you can imagine, this was quite a surprise to many people working in the sexual and reproductive rights and health community, because they're, along refrigerant management and wind turbines, you suddenly see access to contraception, for example. So these two topics were featured because of their role in reducing fertility. So when people have access to family planning services, they have less children. And when girls gain access to education and stay in education, they also tend to have less children. So these calculations were made within the framing of climate change mitigation. And so they were also focused on places where you see high and rapid population growth, which are in the global south. So in many ways, this was suggesting action on the most affected people in the most affected areas. And while access to contraception is key to upholding human rights, achieving bodily autonomy, and having good health care, this suggestion here has received strong critique and raised alarm amongst reproductive justice activists, as well as other actors in the space. So if we think back to the questions about whose reproduction is encouraged and discouraged and under what circumstances, and I argue that that question is always a quick guide to thinking about some of the ways that oppression operates in our society, then this kind of provides an interesting example. So we can see that the solution for climate change being suggested here very much relies on the intervention of women's bodies in some of the most affected areas, but also some of the least responsible locations for the climate crisis. And many argue that this does not call into account the true drivers of the climate crisis, which have to do with consumption, the unequal distribution of resources, continued investment in fossil fuels, unchecked capitalism, and other large-scale drivers. And there's concern that framing such as this one can make family planning a sort of instrumental quick fix that distracts from the true drivers of the crisis and sort of locates the solution far away from where the climate crisis was caused, and also sort of not focus on the full provision of sexual and reproductive rights and health services, but kind of have too much of a focus on family planning as an intervention. So there is a long and dark history related to demographic goals and targets, which has resulted in numerous reproductive injustices. People often refer to this as a thing of the past, but we do continue to see aspects of population control thinking and reproductive control and coercion from top-down actors all around us in present day. And I think we can see many examples of that even recently. So the climate and health space must be aware of this history and interrogate solutions to ensure they're not false solutions, don't replicate oppressive thinking, or place undue burdens on the populations least responsible for the crisis. So taking on access to contraception with a mitigation lens has been challenged because it locates the solution far away from the drivers, doesn't call those truly accountable, kind of lets them off the hook potentially, and also upholds longstanding tropes and logics about whose bodies are intervenable, whose reproduction is discouraged, and who's held responsible for the behaviors and consequences of wealthier countries. So the framings and discourses we really use in this space matter, and it really informs the policies and programs that sort of take hold. And so we want to ensure the right things are being placed in the frame. And if you'd like to learn more about this intersection, work by Jade Sasser and others has done a good job exploring it. So that's not to say that access to contraception is not an important part of responding to climate change. And there's many people worldwide who would like access to family planning and cannot access this. But, and it is essential to achieving bodily autonomy, gender equality, and justice. But as mentioned, people need control over their bodies to best respond to their personal circumstances. And this is true in general, and even more in times that are unstable, precarious, and difficult, such as those climate change is bringing into frequency. So we do encourage access to family planning and contraception as an adaptation and resilience building strategy, but query a focus on mitigation. And for a third example, turning again to something quite different, I'd like to talk about reproductive refusal and reconsideration in the face of climate change. So another way that reproductive and environmental concerns are taking hold is through people reconsidering having children as a result of the climate crisis. And this tends to bring together different kinds of anxiety. So reproductive anxiety, ecological anxiety, sometimes demographic anxiety, and shows how climate change impacts not only, even impacts how we think about our own lives, our futures, our families, and, our intimate and personal choices too. And there has been recent work by Schneider Meyerson and Kit Ling Leong that actually looks at some surveys about how prevalent this type of concern is. And this tends to be something more focused in global North countries. So my colleague, Catherine Dow at Cambridge, and I have been looking at this phenomena by exploring 3 different collectives, one in the United States, one in Canada, and one in the UK. And what we're finding is that consistently across interviews, declarations, pledges, and other actions that these groups have been taking is that they feel too afraid and too unsure about the future because of the climate crisis, that they feel they can't have children. And they've been using this, this fear and this concern as a kind of lever to try to fight for political change and to ring the existential alarm about climate change and sort of galvanize a collective and political action. And really what is shared is this diagnostic of an uncertain future. That's really what unifies the groups. And these groups came up between 2015 and present, and there's kind of 3 of them that we've been exploring. At the moment, the only one that's still in operation is Conceivable Future in the US, where they sort of do group discussions about people's fear about reproducing during climate change. Birth Strike for Climate, which was in the UK, disbanded, and No Future, No Children is no longer in operation either. But I think one important thing when looking at Birth Strike for Climate is the reasons that they disbanded. And one of the reasons was because of the relentless association with population discourses. So they felt like they were consistently associated with telling people to have less children, which is not what they were doing. What they were trying to do is say, we're so concerned about this, we need to take a collective and government action and really tackle the structural drivers of the crisis. And then the other reason was that they felt that the media really relentlessly focused on individual decision-making. So they were kind of saying, positioning having children as similar to eating less meat or riding your bicycle more. And they felt that this kind of relentless focus on individual actions was, again, not centering the structural drivers of the climate crisis, not taking political action to reduce emissions, and really sort of distracting from what really needed to take place. So this example links to the reproductive justice tenet of being able to raise children in safe and healthy environments. And at least 2 of these collectives were trying to use their reproductive choices as a tool to spur government action. But they were also assuming that their reproduction was valued and sort of important enough to be newsworthy, which also links to this idea of this important question of whose reproduction is encouraged and valued. So this is complex, and it's part of what makes the example interesting. And it also provides quite a contrast to the previous examples. So I share these contemporary examples of coming together between reproductive and environmental and climate concerns to really show the diverse ways that these intersections are being positioned within contemporary conversations around responding to the climate crisis. And I also think they're very helpful in helping us think through and think with some of the frameworks that I just introduced. So now I know I'm trying to cover a lot of ground today. I'd like to now just move on to thinking a little bit about what we can do. I think I'd like to start by saying that really all actions that we take that help uphold justice, that help reduce inequality, are really actions that are supportive of this intersection. So everything that sort of builds gender equality, for example, that builds resilience to climate change, for example, are all sort of indirectly supportive of upholding sexual and reproductive rights and health. But I also tried to think about what people working directly as medics and within healthcare services can do, and we'll present a kind of small list to you here now. Well, in general, I think we need more voice and visibility for these intersections. And I like this idea that the people who are closest to the problems are also closest to the solutions. So really highlighting people's lived experiences, the sort of innovations they're making on the ground where they live. We need better and mandatory representation and inclusion in climate policy and action. We also need to account for the full range of SRHR, and lots of times in the space where I work, people think that by including gender or by including health, that will also mean that we're including sexual and reproductive rights in health. But I would argue that it needs its own mention and its own set of recommendations, because what we've seen so far is that's not necessarily the case. People taking a gender lens or health lens may not extend to include aspects of sexual and reproductive rights in health. We also need more research and differentiated and disaggregated data so we can better see the unequal impacts of the climate crisis on particular groups. We also need local research and research made by people where they live using participatory methods that really amplify and highlight the voices of people who are encountering these intersections. We also need to hold the right actors accountable, challenge false solutions, commit financially to adaptation and resilience building, including things like loss and damage. Really, gender equality, sexual and reproductive rights and health is more likely to get funding from adaptation programs and mitigation programs. And we may not, always want those intersections to be happening with sexual and reproductive rights and health anyway. So these are some of the things that we need broadly. In terms of health providers, I think there's a number of actions that can be taken, thinking about health professionals. So really asking and understanding how climate and reproductive health concerns come together for patients. And I remember someone telling me who worked at Planned Parenthood that they were some of the first to hear about some of the issues in Flint, Michigan from their clients, for example. We also need to document and, see if you're seeing patterns, trends, cases amongst people that you're seeing in your work. So really documenting that and then advocating that. So using voice and power to speak up between the linkages between health, climate, and sexual and reproductive health and rights. And as well as educating patients about the linkages as well. Collaborating with allied services and mobilizing your power. So really that privilege, that position, that access to evidence, but also how you hear about lived experiences, really using that to inform more responsive and just policy and provision. And then there's a few more practical examples on the side. So, health reminders for pregnant women during heat waves, providing maps to cooling stations, doctors' letters to try to support better environmental conditions for people, collecting data, really educating and advocating and onwards. Also making the connections between the social and environmental determinants of health and thinking back to some of the key questions that the frameworks introduced asks of us. And then amplifying the voices and lived experiences of those really facing the acute intersections. And then there's some very specific guidance from some professional medical bodies included here too. And the American College of OB-GYNs, for example, recognizes that climate change is an urgent women's health concern and a major public health challenge. And also we see FIGO recommending that reproductive and other health professionals advocate for policies to prevent exposure to toxic environmental chemicals, work to ensure a healthy food system, make environmental health part of healthcare, and champion environmental justice. Outside of that space, there's a growing amount of work going on in this area. It's really kind of skyrocketed in the last 4 or 5 years, especially the last 2. And so we have a sexual and reproductive rights and health and climate justice coalition formed from civil society organizations internationally who work on this intersection at the annual climate summits and in climate policy. There's position papers by International Planned Parenthood Federation, numerous reports that are helping make these linkages, help understand the ways that these are coming together for people, and also help us advocate to ensure that our responses to the climate crisis create more justice and really truly take account of the true kind of complexity of these intersections. So to conclude, if the climate crisis is one of inequality, then we must consider intersections with sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice. These areas are often neglected, attacked, and under-considered, but are absolutely essential. They're essential for achieving justice of any kind, be that social justice, gender equality, racial justice, and more. And so they definitely also include climate justice. And these intersections struggle to get adequate support and funding at the best of times, and especially when there's competing priorities, which encourages us to amplify their need and ring the alarm about these being an important intersection to take account of. We have to challenge false solutions and really hold the true drivers of the crisis to account. So a just climate response means taking on complex intersections, prioritizing the needs of marginalized groups, challenging existing logics that created our current picture of collapse, and placing emphasis on neglected topic areas such as this. So if the climate crisis is a multifold crisis, it is also one of bodily autonomy, and upholding sexual and reproductive rights and health is fundamental to the response. So thank you for listening and learning with me today. I have the references here, but mostly I'd like to say thank you, and hopefully we also still have enough time to engage some of your questions. So thanks very much.
Great, thank you so much. So we do have a question in the chat I can read off, and you should be able to see it too on your side, Dr. McMullen. And then we'll do this one, and then we'll see where we're at time-wise, because we're going to close at 55. So Amanda said, I'm curious how this all overlaps with what is going on in the US in terms of the repeal of Roe v. Wade, and if you have any ideas/tips for how to engage across reproductive justice work and climate justice work to bring the two together more. Are there examples of where that is already happening? So that was asked a little earlier in your talk, so you might have already addressed some of that last part, but yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you for that really important question. I think that there's a number of things going on with that example, and I also think a lot of reproductive justice and climate justice actors are taking this on. So I think one thing it does is it certainly shows us that that sort of reproductive coercion and control is not a thing of the past, and that top-down state actors still continue to intervene and take interest in women's bodies and choices. So I think that helps dispel that narrative. I also think it's sort of a sign of growing resistance and challenge, and even we've seen, for example, the Buffalo shooting and a couple of the other sort of eco-fascist ideologies, for example, engage up from the right wing, engage sort of notions of reproductive control, and also talk about replacement rate and these theories as well. So you're sort of seeing a coming together of extreme sort of right-wing thinking with some eco-fascist discourse, and that does also engage aspects of sexual and reproductive health and rights. So that's certainly been an alarm bell for a lot of actors in the space, and also a reason why we need to really critically think about the ways that we position and work on these intersections. In general, I would take a look at the work of the Women and Gender constituency of the UNFCCC, who really bring together important feminist climate justice actions and challenge sort of any threats to women's bodily autonomy, including around Roe v. Wade, but also see how that intersects and engages with climate justice and action as well. So, I mean, there's a lot to think about with that question, but hopefully that gives you some ideas of how we see these things coming together.
Yes, very true. And thank you so much for the wonderful overview. Maria Zatnik is asking that the difference between reproductive justice and family planning, especially in relation to the climate crisis, is rather subtle. How can we discuss this with the public and or policymakers in a way that it's easy to understand for people unfamiliar with these concepts?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So part of why I wanted to highlight the kind of key questions that we associate with reproductive justice and environmental justice is because I think that they really help us get at some of these intersections. So who's being encouraged to reproduce, who isn't, and under what circumstances, for me is always a really helpful way to start thinking about, and a simple way to start thinking about how these things come together. And one of the most important things the reproductive justice framework does is helps us think about not only rights and choices, but also access. and inequality. So if everybody has a right to choose, but who can actually enact that choice, who can make it real, who can actually access the services? And that's where you start to be able to pull out the different sort of structural drivers that impact people's lives. In relation to these distinctions between reproductive justice and family planning, I think what I've always tried to do in my work is look at the full range of sexual and reproductive rights and health. So if we were only taking a look at family planning or access to contraception, what happens if somebody's accessing your service, but they also are experiencing gender-based violence, or they also have an STI, or they also are experiencing a kind of whole wide range of sexual and reproductive rights and health factors. So really broadening the frame to look at how the climate crisis impacts the wide range of sexual and reproductive rights and health services, I think is one way to sort of keep the frame in a way that's helpful, that helps us look at the right sort of intersections and not overly focus on some of the fertility aspects that have been receiving a lot of attention in this space in previous years.
We have one more question that would be nice if you could answer before we close down the session, from Professor Rahila Amin. I am from Pakistan, and we are having all these issues which you just mentioned, and this is important in flood hit areas of the country. What kind of actions can they take to try to at least begin alleviating the situation?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's a complex question to think about what actions can take, but also increasing the sort of vision and access to sexual and reproductive rights and health services within humanitarian spaces across the board is one that will also help the response in terms of supporting climate and sexual and reproductive rights and health. So the sort of encouraging, the minimum intervention service package that we see in times of disaster, really doing assessments to make sure that the resources are reaching the right groups, not leaving sort of women and girls behind in all of these responses, I think are really key and are going to need a lot more focus and attention in the face of increased climate impacts. And there has been really good work happening in that space, and there is some really good work that happens at the intersection of climate and humanitarian crises. And I think it's important for us to remember that climate change impacts do also include the sort of whole humanitarian space because of disasters and extreme weather events. So really supporting work at those intersections, and also intersections around people on the move and displaced people as well. So really strengthening access to sexual and reproductive health services in those scenarios are also supportive of responding to climate, SRHR, climate and health.
Yes, thank you so much, Heather. And I apologize for those who raised their hands and also didn't have time to have their questions answered. But if Dr. Macmillan would like to answer the Q&A, you could still do it in writing. And with this, I would like to close down our keynote session for the symposium. And in a few minutes, we're going to have our next session on healthcare sustainability. So thank you, everyone, for joining, listening, and asking questions. And a special thanks for Heather for the wonderful presentation. Thank you very much.